Good afternoon and welcome to Ballots Bagels, Conversations with Trusted Election Sources, a series from the German Marshall Fund's Alliance for Securing Democracy, where we'll discuss the security of U.S. elections in the lead up to the 2022 midterms with the people who help protect them. My name is David Levine and I'm the Elections Integrity Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy, a bagel aficionado and your host. For today's third episode, I'd like to welcome Bartow County, Georgia election supervisor Joseph Kirk to discuss Georgia's May 24th primary. Kirk is an elections administrator with a history of conducting secure and transparent elections. He began his career by testing and supporting Georgia's first statewide voting system from 2002 to 2005, before implementing Mississippi's voting system from 2005 to 2007. In 2007, he accepted his current position. Joseph graduated from the University of Georgia with a bachelor's degree in computer science and serves on the executive board for the Georgia Association of Voter Registrars and Election Officials. In the run-up to Georgia's recent primary, there was a great deal of concern. Concern from folks, including candidates or elected officials, who still falsely believe that Georgia's 2020 presidential election was rigged. Concern from folks who believe that passage of the state's 2021 election law would make it harder to vote and easier to interfere in the administration of elections. And concern from election workers who continue to endure threats and harassment while confronting an avalanche of lies and accusations about the elections process. That list doesn't even include concerns from election officials about implementing the changes from last year's law, redistricting, and a new electronic voter registration system. Election day in Bartow County was certainly no picnic, but the results did reflect the will of Bartow County voters, and I look forward to discussing this, bagels, and more with Bartow County Election Supervisor Joseph Kirk. Joseph, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here. Appreciate you having me.
The pleasure's mine. Joseph, let's jump right in. Countless election officials have noted the sharp contrast between administering elections now and before 2020, something that you know a bit about. In a recent PBS NewsHour story, you noted that some of your poll workers have been threatened and harassed and that you've had to beef up security to protect them. And on election day, you were quoted as saying that there was palpable animosity at several county polling places. A county that former President Donald Trump won by more than 50 points in 2020. Can you tell our listeners a bit about your initial motivation for becoming an elections administrator? And then, given the threats and harassment, can you tell us what actions you've been taking to help protect yourself and your colleagues, particularly since 2020?
Well, I guess starting back, way back when I made a decision to go into elections, I started because I needed a summer job. It was the summer after my freshman year in college. I needed to make some money, and Georgia and the Center for Election Systems at Kennesaw State University just got the contract to implement the state's voting system. And I was hired for the strength of my back, not my mind. Ended up coming on a little bit early, helping to set up a call center, getting some training that a lot of folks didn't have because I happened to be there at the time. I was in the initial training session with the Secretary of State's office, my boss, his boss, from some of Diebold's top trainers at the time, and learned some really interesting things. And spent the next few years while I was in college working for the center in the summers, and then for Athens, Clark County, as well as some other counties during the school year under contract, supporting their voting systems. And about the time I graduated with a degree in computer science, I realized that there were a lot of computer science majors out there, and the jobs were a little bit hard to find back then. But I had experience in elections that no one else had, and managed to go over to the Mississippi Secretary of State's office, spent 2 years out there implementing their voting system, met some great people, got some great experience. But I grew up in the county next door to Bartow County and Floyd County and wanted to be close to my family, so I came back here, took this job with the expectation to be here for a few years and to move on to something different, something bigger, and fell in love with the community and fell in love with the work that I do here. And I've been here ever since. You know, we talk about the elections bug. It definitely bit me back then, and I can't see myself doing anything else.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And of course, it's interesting, too, because I feel like so many of my conversations with folks who've worked in elections, these folks have basically said how they sort of fell into it by accident. And while you may not have, maybe as you were going through school necessarily dreamt of being an election official, you at least had an experience which you were then, you were able to gain some experience, as you alluded to, and parlay that into elections. Just to follow up on the second piece of what what I had mentioned, the issue of sort of election workers and threats, I think, is something that continues to be sort of a major issue. Certainly one that took off in 2020 and continues in the aftermath of that election. And in fact, it sounded as if, right, it was something that was at play in the recent primary in your county. In fact, shortly after that primary, you acknowledged that your office had a really hard time finding enough people to staff the county's polling places, and that this impacted, right, the county's administration of the primary. I'm hoping you could tell us a little bit about what you and your colleagues have tried to do to try and make it safer for election workers to serve, as well as telling a little bit about how the challenge of recruiting enough workers affected your ability to conduct that primary election. Because as a former official, I know that was the kind of thing that would keep me up at night.
Oh, absolutely. And I think to start this conversation off, that there's two components to this. There's the safety and animosity piece, and then there's recruiting for this previous primary. And the main problem I had, and I'm not saying that the animosity, the safety wasn't a factor, but the major issue I had was the date of the election. And I keep saying, I'm going to keep saying, and I'll continue to say it, is we asked the legislature, we being the election officials in Georgia in 2021, to change the date of this primary, foreseeing it was going to be an issue, foreseeing that redistricting was going to take longer than we anticipated, foreseeing that because of school schedules and summer schedules, we would have a hard time with not only poll workers, but maybe facilities. And I didn't have that issue here, but say people that use schools, maybe not be able to use the school in the last week of the school session. So we saw this coming. We asked to change the date. We were ignored. And as a result, many of my longtime workers who want to continue serving, for some reason, could not serve on that day. And that made it a huge challenge.
No, I think that's a really excellent point. I mean, I know that the 2014 Presidential Commission on Election Administration talked about, right, the importance of schools as polling places. And if you're already having enough time getting people to serve because of the long hours and the lack of pay and maybe the threats, now add on to that schools may not be available, graduation, summer vacation. I could certainly see how this would have been, that would have been a challenge.
Exactly. And then as a result, and then, people were ill, there were family emergencies. I've never seen an election quite like this in terms of staffing, even in 2020. So, for example, on election day, I had a polling place that was scheduled to have a manager, 2 assistant managers, and 5 clerks. And the best we could do for them was an experienced management crew and then 5 new employees that had about 2 hours of training to come help. And on election day, only 2 of them managed to show up. And they conducted this election with basically half their staff. And it was amazing they managed to accomplish it. And I'm just so thankful they stayed and are staying with me after that and going through that. But getting back to the safety component, we've been fairly, I hesitate to say lucky here, but there haven't been a lot of specific threats. Specific meaning, I'm going to do this to you if this happens, or something along those lines. Most of the people who deal with me through the political parties, including the Republican Party, trust my office because I've always emphasized transparency and observation. And anyone who comes to observe me trusts the process, at least in my county. And that might be a good point to come back to you later, the whole phrase, at least in my county. But what we're seeing is folks who aren't participating in the process on any level, who aren't observing, who aren't participating in party meetings, who aren't talking to their local party at all, who are just getting their information offline, coming in already angry, already frustrated, and even if they realize the poll workers aren't the ones who make the decisions, they're taking their frustration out on the poll workers, even in just how they speak in the small interaction they have. For example, I had one person in this last election who spent 30 minutes at the screen of a ballot marking device, 20 minutes with the poll manager, or I guess 10 by himself, 10 with the poll manager, and then 10 on the phone with me, complaining about the operation of the machine, about some function of the machine and how he didn't think that was good and how the average, he understood the process, but the average person wouldn't understand this. And I finally had to just say, would you mind completing your voting experience, making the machine available for someone else, and we can continue this, call me later, we can continue this conversation later. And he's not reached back out to me, but it was important enough for him on election day to spend 30 minutes at a ballot marking device making his will known, but not enough to follow up with me after the election. And I plan on reaching out to him later, actually.
No, it's fascinating, and I want to run with this for a couple of reasons. I mean, one of the things that it makes me think of is sort of the $20,000 question is what one can do to try and remedy or mitigate the challenges associated with this. You obviously play a significant role in terms of working with the legislature on these sorts of issues. You're involved in sort of some of the voter outreach and voter education efforts, certainly at the county level, but also statewide. You're part of the bipartisan task force there. What are things that you think you and your team, may try and do to try and mitigate these kinds of challenges going forward, knowing, of course, that it's not only on you to come up with solutions, right?
Well, I think the path ahead of us, at least to me, is very clear. And it's the two words I keep coming back to: education and observation. Through transparency. Starting with education, we don't teach, at least in Georgia, anything about the nuts and bolts of registering to vote and voting in schools. We talk about the history of voting. We talk about the founding of our nation and the different movements and the different amendments, but then we just stop. And we never tell them how to register to vote or what's expected of you once you register to vote, if you change your address when you move. Or, here are your options for voting. There's a difference between voting early on before Election Day in person and voting on Election Day. There's different rules to follow. And if we never tell them, how can we expect them to know? Why wouldn't they be frustrated? And no matter how much I try to do as far as public education goes, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And they don't want to learn about it until it matters to them. It doesn't matter to them until they go to vote, and it's too late to learn about it. So I think it all starts in the schools. I'm trying to work with the legislature to update those laws and do some kind of public service video to every high school senior in Georgia every year. And I think it's a simple solution, just to get some basic information out to the community about the process. Because if they know what's expected, if they know what to expect, they won't be as frustrated. And then as far as observation goes, people, I hate to use the word, but folks want to complain about what they read online, and they assume what they read online is true. But there's a lot that goes into what I do for a living that folks have no idea about. And most of what I do is observable. Maybe not the exact information. Maybe you can't come in and observe the signature verification in Georgia. You can observe us doing it, but you can't see the information. You can't see the signatures, just as one example. And when folks do take those opportunities, do come in and observe us actually opening and counting the ballots, or the audits that I conducted, or some of the audits after the elections, or the process of voting, the steps my employees take to verify the identity of voters and make sure those ballots are cast properly as the voters intend, they feel a lot better. But that involves volunteering your time, making time to come in and going through the process, going through training, watching, and not getting paid for it. And while a lot of folks from the parties will do that, once it's sort of a double-edged sword. Once they trust my office, they don't want to do it anymore. But then I can't say I've been observed to get that public confidence from it. And the folks who really have that animosity don't want to engage on that level. So until I can convince them to come and actually watch what's going on, I'm not sure how to correct this issue, but I know how to do it, which is education and observation.
Yeah. No, I think those are really good, really interesting points. And certainly for those who haven't run in elections, it's the difference between, what you're talking about, which is bolstering election security, and what those who aren't involved with the process, are often engaged in, which is the security theater. Let's transition a bit from, I think, maybe some of the challenges that you've touched on to, I think, some of the successes, that I think took place in the primary. Yes, there's been a fair bit of attention, as there should be, on issues in Georgia's primary, like the computer programming error that forced DeKalb County to conduct a recount for a district commission race. But there were a number of successes. For example, your county recently certified the local results of the primary. And if I got this correctly, and you'll correct me if I got this wrong, as you've kindly done previously, you only 10 of, I think, 631 mail ballots that you guys received had to be rejected, which, at least from where I sit, is a pretty small number, particularly when you consider all of the changes that have been made to Georgia elections since 2020. Your office also, of course, recently conducted a risk-limiting audit of the county's primary results to help ensure that the election outcomes were correct. And I'm hoping you can tell our listeners more about these successes and others, right, that Bartow County achieved during the primary and how you're looking to build upon those successes for future elections.
Absolutely. I think those are some good examples. I guess starting with the absentee ballots, that is a more complicated process than it used to be. We were proactive in public education through local media, which doesn't have a lot of necessarily listeners or readers, but I think that did help a lot. But also, as people made mistakes, reaching out to them, not just doing the bare minimum required by law and sending a letter, but email and phone and explaining what's going on and trying to work with them in a way so they could ensure their ballot was counted. Because, I mean, I think one thing that's worth mentioning here, there's been a lot of talk about the change in rejection rate for absentee ballots in Georgia in 2020. And I can tell you the reason for that. It's very simple. Prior to 2020, the envelope was more complicated. It required a lot more information in addition to a signature. So the number of ballots that were rejected in 2020 statewide and in Bartow County, percentage-wise, for a signature mismatch actually rose in 2020. The number of ballots that were rejected because of an administrative error where we knew it was the right person, but they didn't put some information they needed to on the ballot, that was nil in 2020 because we changed the envelope and changed the process to make it easier for them. So that's the reason for changing the rejection rate. There was nothing nefarious there. So when they changed the law to make the application more cumbersome, maybe a good word for it, to require more information on that, when they changed the requirements for the envelope to make more information on the envelope, or require more information on the envelope, in addition to a signature, we still check for a signature match. We try to be proactive as they came in. And for example, when folks came into the office, let's open it in front of you. Let's make sure you filled it out correctly before you leave. That way, if there's going to be corrected, you can do it while you're here. If we couldn't catch them then, if they sent them through the mail, then, well, we would reach out to them. Here's the process to follow to make sure your ballot can be counted. And in most cases, they were able to do that. Now, one thing that is not included in your statistics, I don't have these handy, but if they didn't cure their application, provisional ballot that was issued as a result of that couldn't be counted either. They had to cure that application by law. There are ballots that weren't received back to us. So things like that still happen, but we accepted more ballots percentage-wise than I ever expected to, and I'm very glad, and I think that was because of that proactive effort. Getting to your other point about the rule limiting audit, that's what I do for every single election. Just to say for folks who may not know the difference, that the goal of an audit is to confirm that we didn't declare the wrong winner. While the goal of a recount is to change the winner. And because of that in Georgia, we do the recounts with a scanner, we do the audits by hand. We always see small discrepancies in that auditing process because folks are hand counting ballots. But we didn't see anything in that audit that would change, that gave us any pause. They were all small errors on the part of the auditors, and that went very smoothly. And the amount of confidence I've received from doing those audits is absolutely astounding. Because we've continued the model that was set in 2020 by doing a full hand audit of all the ballots, not just a percentage, ever since the 2020 general election. And to me, the difference in doing that and a percentage is when someone calls and says, how do I know my ballot was counted properly? I don't have to say, well, because statistically we're confident. I can say, I know because we checked every single ballot. Yours was in there, so yours was counted properly. And that simple explanation really, really helps with public confidence. So the people that come in with concerns, in most cases, when I give them that explanation, when they observe that audit, they feel better when they leave.
It's actually really interesting, Joseph, to hear you make that point. I know that, when the National Academy of Sciences came out with their report a few years back, they actually recommended that election officials within a 10-year period of time move to doing risk-limiting audits, right, across the country. It's worth noting that I believe that was in 2016, and of course that would be until 2026. But your point, in fact, is that while you do the risk-limiting audits, is that you've actually seen an uptick potentially in confidence from being able to tell folks that you've counted each and every single one of those ballots. I'm curious, for jurisdictions maybe that are perhaps a bit bigger than yours, are there lessons for them on maybe, how they might be able to navigate that, or is it just that this is something particularly for smaller jurisdictions that they should look at if they can?
I think, and this is just me, and I've never managed a larger jurisdiction, but practice makes perfect. And it all becomes a question of scale. So it took us, I think it was 3 days to audit the 2020 general election. It's that one presidential race. But that was with our scrambling. We did not anticipate doing that process. That was designed very quickly, and we had to make it work. But I also did the 2021 federal runoff that happened in January. And that was 43,000 ballots out of 75,000. So over 50% of my voters voted in that election. We got that audit done in a day with just a little bit of practice. And ever since then, I have conducted these audits in a day or less. This last one I did was a fraction of the ballots, but it was the most complicated race we've ever audited. It was a primary race. It was the gubernatorial race. There were a lot of different categories to sort the ballots into, different candidates' names or different statuses for ballots, blank or undervoted, I should say, or ballots that have been duplicated to go to a vote review panel, things like that. And even then, if we had had a full staff that day, we would have been done a little bit after lunch. So it's not expensive, it's not hard, and it's just a question of scale. So if you bring in more teams, more auditors, which the larger jurisdictions can afford to do, larger spaces, this is entirely possible, and I really think worth doing. Because we have a national conversation going on right now about ballot marking devices and how ballots are marked. And my contention is no matter how a ballot's marked, as long as the voter has the opportunity to review that ballot, especially the top races, because those are the ones with the highest threat level or risk profile. And I can tell you that in this previous election, I had to deploy more equipment during because of what I saw during advanced voting, because so many folks were standing at the machines, carefully reviewing their ballots for a period of minutes. They were looking at them to make sure they said what they wanted to say and spoiling them and redoing them if that's not what they wanted. And so if we'd have that, a paper ballot, and then we review that ballot after the election, the conversations about how the ballot is marked is taking time away from the things that really, really matter to election integrity, which is the post-election audit, which is the post-election canvas that we're not talking about so much. We spend time talking about, forensic audits rather than a canvas process that already exists that needs to be strengthened. So I really think the more we do these audits, the better off we'll be, and the less these other conversations we'll have.
We've touched a lot on sort of a certain amount of things that did happen in the election, as you've also touched on. There's also the perception side of this as well. Just to come back to go into this a little more detail, I know that on the eve of the primary, right, I think you were quoted as saying that there are certain folks out there that I will never be able to convince of how this, meaning I think elections, really works, even if I show them step by step. That's when it gets really frustrating. We know that, right, when people in positions of trust spread misinformation about election processes so close to an election. Of course, that comment you made was on the eve of the primary. That combined with that general lack of understanding that you've described can create this dangerous scenario where people don't trust the results, which can put American democracy in a really precarious place. January 6th, and of course, Georgia democracy as well. I'm interested in, you've obviously talked a bit about what you did, with some folks externally. I'm curious what preparations you made with your team internally to respond to false information about the elections process, because, as someone who was a former election official looking at this from afar, you could see it everywhere. You saw it in the races, right, for certain Georgia elections. You saw it, right, from voters and a whole host of other actors.
So I try to keep it as simple on my staff as possible. And one thing we've taught you is sort of the safety component, so just touch on it very quickly. As folks are getting agitated, we educate local law enforcement on election laws, on penalties for those laws. We made sure they were close on election day. We don't want a physical presence at the polls because of possible concerns of intimidation. But if we needed them, they were there. And luckily, that didn't really come up. But we prepared that way to be sure that if anything happened, people were ready to defend my staff. As far as combating the mis and mal and disinformation, I try to put things in writing. So, for example, one of the talking points around here against the process is the mini voting systems. And I will tell you, I have no problem with mini voting systems because I check. I check every election to make sure they're counted properly, and I can say with complete confidence those votes were counted accurately.
And just a quick word there on that, right? Dominion voting systems are voting systems from one of the three major vendors in the U.S. The Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency recently put out an advisory that touched on them, noting that there were some vulnerabilities, but that most of them, the vast majority, could be mitigated by certain efforts election officials were already doing, and there was no evidence that any of those vulnerabilities were exploited in 2020.
Absolutely, and I think the chief among those things we can do are, again, these audits, that we can check and make sure that nothing happened by looking at the text that the voters looked at. And that's just a simple solution, a low-tech solution to make sure that these systems are secure. But there's a handout that I give my staff, my poll workers, talking about makes 2 points. That every ballot cast in Bartow County is a paper ballot. It's marked by hand, marked by ballot metric device. It's a paper ballot. We audit it. We verify the results that way. And 2, all tabulation happens locally. One of the allegations been made is that votes went overseas and came back and were somehow changed. I can tell you that's not true, especially in my office at least, because I can speak for my office, because I installed my server. I know it's not connected to anything. And I know that the actual results reside in my office. Anything we put online is unofficial, is just there for convenience sake. The official results are downstairs in a locked room right now, and I'm going to take them to the state tomorrow, sign up my board, hear the real results from this election. Everything else is just extra. So, and then the other thing my staff does, my poll workers do, is they know my feelings on this. They have my business cards. And if somebody wants to have a discussion, they tell them that I would love to have a discussion with them. Call me. I would love to talk to them. And for some reason, I never get any phone calls from that. It's a hobby, and no one wants to talk to me about it.
So basically, the equation is paper ballots plus strong chain of custody protocols plus robust post-election audits equals a strong, secure election. I know we're coming to the end of this, sadly, so I want to make sure I get a chance to ask you just a couple other things, Joseph, before we go. One of the things is that during our conversation, you've touched on a number of different threats that you've dealt with, that you're confronting, and undoubtedly that you're likely to confront moving forward. I'm curious what you think the biggest threat, right, to the integrity of U.S. elections is, right now, right? Whether it's election security, disinformation, right, voter access. You of course, have touched on the Election Integrity Act of 2021 that was passed last year and mentioned a couple of concerns you had there. I'm interested, though, in hearing from you on what you happen to think is the biggest threat to the integrity of U.S. elections right now.
Well, it's actually, in my opinion, none of the things you mentioned. It's a lack of knowledge in the general public for how elections are actually administered. Getting back to the education component, we never teach students how this actually works. And it creates a vacuum of knowledge that anybody can fill with a keyboard to internet access. And once they read it online, it must be true. So that vacuum of knowledge to me is the biggest threat and the thing we need to be addressing at every level. And that has to start in the schools. It has to start with educating students. And one very short anecdote, I used to go to a high school in the county, and I want to start doing this because I had time, and educate the senior class about the voting process, sort of like I'm describing. What we noticed out of that segment of our community where there were less questions about the process after a few years of doing that. Because the kids would go home and talk to their parents and neighbors and friends. And they would spread what they learned in school. It all starts there to me. And if we can get to them there and start educating them on the actual process, we'll see less and less misinformation because they'll already have the right information.
Inoculation through education. I like it. At the risk of being redundant here, Joseph, though I think if it is, you'll let me know, and if not, that'll work out well. As you look towards the November general elections, I know that there may be some stuff in between, but I'm curious about two things, right? One, what's the one bagel that you can't live without? After all, this is Ballots and Bagels. And what's the one piece of advice you would give other election officials, right, based on your primary experience?
So as far as bagels go, I'm not an aficionado like you are. For me, it's just a plain bagel with the everything cream cheese on top, or for me, a cream cheese alternative because I can't have any dairy products, which makes it harder for me to get bagels. So forgive me. But as far as my experience goes, poll watchers and observers are your friends. With the right, and I realize there's some of them that have the worst of intentions, and there's no turning those folks around, and that's an entirely different topic of conversation. But for the most part, welcoming observers in, being grateful they're there, and letting them know that you're grateful they're there, and educating them on the process creates an ally and an advocate. And it gives you the opportunity to say later when someone is angry, when someone is on the phone with you, railing on how they think the election went, to say, well, if you don't believe what I'm saying, call your local party, call your local whoever observed, your local campaign, and ask them what they think. And if you're not satisfied with that answer, call me back. And as I say that, I never get those phone calls back. So I don't know if they don't follow up on it, but having those observers there has created an entirely different dynamic in my county, and has got me through 2020, because I got angry phone calls. I could refer them to someone else who was there, who did observe me, who was not on my payroll, who was actually an advocate for me, not an enemy.
Now, I think that's an excellent point. I do have to have one follow-up to that, though, particularly in light of some recent news reports that have come out, Joseph. Part of the thing, even for partisan observers in the past, was that a lot of what your answer was, of course, was predicated on a sort of a good faith assumption about American elections. For those folks who perhaps may be seeking to observe the process, who may not have the best of intentions, does that change at all, right? For how you relate to those folks, and is there anything that you're thinking about doing, right, in response to that? I know we've begun to see some election officials alter, for example, trainings in response to that potential threat.
Well, and I'm familiar with the report you're referring to. I got about 2/3 of the way through it before I got pulled away to something else. But I understand the concept. One thing to point out is in Georgia, we have no concept of an election challenger. So any voter can challenge any of the voters' right to vote, but it rarely happens at the polling place on election day. They're not there, and observers for us are not there to challenge the process. They're called poll watchers here. They're to observe the process, see a problem, they have to step outside, call my office, call whoever they're working for, let them know there's a process they go through. But what I would hope, and again, there are certain people that I do believe have the worst of intentions, who are there trying to disrupt the process, and I have no time for that, and I would, take whatever I need to take to stop that if I saw it happening. But what I have seen is people who come in with the most questions, with the most concerns, who may have started from that place, seeing what goes on behind the curtain, and realizing they were wrong. And again, they become advocates. So I realize there's some out there who would not fall in that category. Luckily, I've not had to deal with that yet, and I am prepared through my attorney, through my district attorney, different folks to deal with that if the issue arises. But until then, I'm going to assume people are coming with the best of intentions. Treat them well, welcome them in, show them what we're doing, and try to get an ally rather than an advocate in that way.
No, I appreciate your answer. I appreciate the nuance, and I also appreciate your faith. Obviously, in U.S. elections and democracy, it's frankly part of the reason that we're having this series. Joseph Kirk from Bartow County, thank you for coming on to Ballots and Bagels to discuss the Georgia primary, and good luck, right, with your future elections. I'd also just like to thank Rachel Dean Wilson, Kayla Goodson, Krisha Sikora, and Hannah Foreman for making this interview possible, Abby Foreman for her branding work, and Zachary Tarrant for his audio and graphics help. Ballots and Bagels, Conversations with Trusted Sources is a production of the Alliance for Securing Democracy. Thanks for listening in. And until next time, like Joseph said, keep the faith in U.S. elections.